would you be able to give a brief definition of consciousness?
Sure.
Whoever wants to go first, let's start.
He said sure first.
Yeah,
He
go-
did.
go for it.
Sure, yeah.
I think the simplest, shortest definition of consciousness is awareness. But I think probably is true for all of us up here since we've been studying this quite a while. I think it makes sense to talk about it as coming in two parts. Number one is awareness, and then number two, what do you do with that awareness? How do you structure what you know and what you're aware of? So I see it as primarily being awareness, but then I see a secondary component of, with that awareness, what structures do you create or follow in order to process the awareness that you come in contact with?
So like awareness and its interpretation.
No, more than interpretation. Are y'all comfortable with me just going way off into space here?
Yep. Sure.
Okay. It can be argued that anywhere you see that form exists, there's a consciousness behind that form, that it requires a consciousness to maintain it. So in a human being, you could say it manifests as a personality. There's certain traits that the person follows. There's a way. There's beliefs that they choose to hold. There's a way that they have chosen or habituated themselves to think. And those processes create a product or a form that we call personality. Well, if you really look at reality, in my opinion, and you start breaking it down into finer and finer pieces, you can argue anywhere reality is structured to go down a certain path, it is consciousness that creates that channel. So it's my personal belief that you could say, arguably, an electron has a consciousness of being a negative particle. And an atom has a consciousness of holding whatever particles it maintains together. So more than just, I think it's more than just reaction. I think it's processes and structures that consciousness chooses to hold on to as a semi-solidified state. It's kind of like you say consciousness is gas. In comparing it to water, you say consciousness is like a gaseous state, but yet it can be chilled and cooled and frozen into an ice cube, an ice sculpture, whatever form you want to mold it into. And so long as it holds that form, there's some level of consciousness in operation. That's my opinion.
I would say that I agree with that. I would add that my definition I would normally use is that consciousness is a spectrum that sits on top of increasing levels of, let's say, entity, for example. I am me. The I am right there is my awareness, okay? But there is a train of thought which I'm fond of, that we are in fact all connected, okay? That we are just different points of view of another consciousness, okay? I can't see beyond that. I could theorize about it, but I could also theorize what movie's playing in the 747, but I've got no idea. But my immediate focus is on the next level of consciousness beyond my own, okay? So, yes, I think all what you say can be true, and I think that there is, an anesthesiologist will tell you there are 140 levels of consciousness, okay, that they define. So, yeah, that's weird, huh?
Yeah. In a human 40.
140, yeah. Unless he was drunk when he told me.
In a human being.
Yeah, in a human being.
Yeah.
So,
Most human beings.
yeah. So, so yeah, that's my thought. It's a spectrum and it exists within ever-increasing layers of entity.
The spectrum, you're referring to spectrum as energy? Or it's just...
Levels of consciousness. A rock may or may not be conscious in a way that I understand, but that doesn't mean it's not conscious. Okay, I may think of myself as highly conscious. Get me to the wrong bar on the wrong night, and everyone can have a different opinion about that. If there is an entity above us which doesn't think the way we do, because it may not be made of meat, it can still be conscious and aware. These are levels of consciousness. I myself have several levels of consciousness, as do you. I don't know about the chair. I don't know what levels of consciousness a chair has. I know it's good at being a chair most of the time, and it doesn't really serve much purpose when it's no longer a chair. So maybe it feels good about being a chair, I don't know. But I don't have a frame of reference to go with that. So I generally concentrate on life itself, DNA, I believe DNA has a consciousness, that it communicates with other DNA, and we can talk about that as we go on. Yeah, I can't remember what the question was, but I hope that answered it.
Can I jump in on that?
Sure.
If you look at, and you were asking about levels of consciousness, if you look at consciousness, and this may help give you a frame of reference for extrapolating into whatever direction you want to go. But if we just look at the typical human range of consciousness, you start out, it's a spectrum like Vaughn said, but on the one end you've got the extremely constricted, confined perspective of just unadulterated, pure human ego, like a child. The only thing that child knows is what it wants, okay? I'm hungry, feed me, I'm wet, change my diaper. Has no concept of anything outside itself. It has no concept of society, no concept of how its actions impact other people, none of that. All it knows is me, 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 me. And then as the child grows and its consciousness expands, it has the realization, if I bite mommy's finger, mommy's going to be upset with me. Well, he's starting to have an expanded awareness outside of self to some degree. And as the human grows and evolves and their consciousness evolves, that sphere of awareness gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So you have this child who goes to school and he says, you know what, if I punch my buddy in the nose, he may not like me because I don't like it when I get punched in the nose. Well, in a very simple sense, that kid's consciousness has just doubled because now it's making considerations based on its own frame of reference and the perceived frame of reference of the target of its actions. Gets a little more advanced and it says, okay, I better not call Rob a bad name because somebody else may hear me do it and not like me for it. Well, now the consciousness is expanded. In simple terms, you can say it's tripled because now it's taking on three perspectives: its own, the target of its actions, and that of an independent observer of what it's doing. Well, as consciousness grows and increases, this level of awareness and ability to perceive from gets bigger and bigger until you move all the way up to the spectrum of human consciousness that we're aware of, where you get to universal consciousness. And universal consciousness, theoretically, that consciousness values every perspective that exists within the human experience. May not agree with it, but to some extent it takes into account and finds value that it is there because it sees its place within the whole. And these levels, you can kind of graduate that spectrum like a rainbow and say, okay, well, when consciousness is down here real close to constricted ego, that's one level. And then when it starts thinking about community, that's another level. And then when it starts thinking about country and international politics, that's another level. And then when it starts thinking about every living thing that exists, that's another level. And so these levels are just expansions. I mean, you could view it as like layers of a cake, one level on top of each other, or you could view it as concentric circles that get progressively bigger. Same thing. Yes,
John, I'm sorry to interrupt. I have a hard time with this. Would the distinguished panel, anyone please explain to me the difference between being conscious and being aware?
There's probably, those are interchangeable terms depending on what domain you're in, right? So that's why I kind of chuckled when he said, explain what consciousness is, because it depends on what domain, right? If you talk to a physicist, they're going to have one concept. If you talk to a neurologist, they're going to have a different concept. If you talk to an anesthesiologist, they're probably going to be pretty close to the neurologist. If you talk to a metaphysician, wholly different domain, right? So the way they're thinking about consciousness is completely different. But most people, consciousness and awareness is kind of interchangeable, right?
Yeah.
It's like, so maybe a medical definition is, are you able to respond to your environment? Then you're conscious. But then you go, well, what about the person who's locked in a coma? And they can hear and understand everything that's going around, but they can't respond. Are they still conscious? Right? So it's not like a defined thing. There's a biannual symposium that happens at the University of Arizona, every 2 years, and it's called the Conference on Consciousness, and a whole bunch of the smartest people on the planet get together and they talk about it, because nobody really, there's not like a clear definition.
Well, can we pass that out just a little bit for a second and have a question? I have a smartphone in my pocket, or so it claims. I can press a button and it will tell me exactly where it is. Okay, I will say it tells me where I am. Actually, no, it's telling Well,
where
it is, okay. Is that an awareness? It isn't a consciousness, I don't think.
I mean,
Somebody,
yeah,
somebody programmed that awareness into it, so it still has some degree of human consciousness aligned with it. It didn't self.
Does the phone know where it is, or does the phone have some information that you can access
Well,
about where it is?
this is where we always get into a grey area, because let's pass out that sentence. Does the phone know where it is? Okay, where is that? Where is the knowing piece?
The phone
Okay.
device.
The phone is
There's
telling me.
there's no
but
knowing
there may be
until
no
you,
consciousness.
in my world, there's no knowing until you access the information, and then you
Because
know
we're
it,
the
but
observer.
the phone doesn't know squat.
Right.
The phone is an inanimate object that has information in it.
But someone programmed
But
the
that's
phone
my
to do that.
physics background that keeps me.
So what if? How many people saw the movie Ex Machina? Oh, go ahead.
Let me interject one thing here.
Oh, sorry.
Consciousness is a pretty word, and so is awareness. From what I've read, physics and elsewhere like that, get down to the bottom layer. I've never heard anybody mention it except you on this here. What if you just went to the basic layer of saying consciousness is nothing more than information transfer, period, at the basic level? We know now theoretically, but we know experimentally because they've done it recently, entangled photons can be separated, and through their passing of information, one flips, the other one flips instantaneously. Address it at that basic level. It is nothing more than information transfer. Then from that primitive level, put all the layers that you want to in your spectrum of consciousness and awareness. What do you do with that information that is transferred? Whether it's molecule to molecule, proton to proton, plant to plant, animal, and so on up through the celestial spheres. It is nothing more than information transfer.
So the first question I would have is, why is the information being transferred in the first place?
That's a phenomenon of reality, physical reality.
Right,
It just
but,
happens,
but,
right?
but we are saying, I agree that there is, everything is information transfer. The longest journey to the stars is information transfer. Right now, we can travel 70, 80 miles an hour down the freeway, and that keeps our economy going pretty good. When we were traveling at 10 miles an hour, the economy worked a lot slower. We're just starting to enter the world of space. That's a, sorry.
The space and space.
Yeah, the space of space. And we travel very slowly right now. So any economics we build up there is going to be very slow. But he's right, it's information transfer. But we know why we're doing it. Okay? Why does a black hole spit out some information and not others? Why does any of this information process occur in the first place?
But there's
What
a,
about, we haven't done it might be helpful if we continue, because there's a few more people to talk about consciousness, and we each kind of come from a different perspective. Some of this stuff overlaps, like my thing about awareness would be tying into that, and then we come back to going back and forth, because some of these might be answered by our own perception
Yes.
of what consciousness is.
One quick question, Al?
Thank you. I want to get back to the two of you guys talking about one word, and that's spectrum. And where does the spectrum come from before the understanding of I? Because it's not created then.
That's interesting, because you mentioned the Kabbalah earlier. And although when I said the word spectrum, I wasn't thinking about it in those terms, it truly is a spectrum that you're talking about, a single source that's split into a spectrum like a light beam passing through a prism on a Pink Floyd album. Anyone get that? Okay.
Yeah.
So
what was your
Yeah.
question, like where
Yeah,
does the spectrum concept arise from?
Well, I mean, and as Frank was talking about information, where does the information come from before the consciousness of the singularity then says I, which comes before I am? And at that point is where everything comes together, where energy then is coming together to be able to form a nucleus around an atom, and then matter has come together, and then you have the laws of attraction, of gravity, of all this. That's what I'm talking about. Where does...
There's something key there that I think doesn't get talked about a whole lot, is how much of that stuff is something that's out there, and how much of that is constructs that we've created to describe things.
Correct.
Right? So electrons charge, descriptions, the word spectrum, the concept of the spectrum, these are all human inventions,
Right.
right? This is just stuff we made up to try to describe what's going on. It's not like that actually is something that's there. It's our models, our maps, our ways of trying to get a grasp on what's going on. So there's a lot of that stuff that's just concepts we made up, so they're not concrete or anything. I don't know, that probably doesn't help, but
It doesn't answer.
Okay, so there were three levels talked about in Jewish mysticism: the Ein, the Ein Sof, and the Ein Sof Earth. Okay, and each one of those represented a different thing. The very first one, before anything, is expressed as limitless nothing. It's basically a null state. Okay, there isn't even anyone around to say that's nothing.
Correct.
Okay? Then it moves to limitless nothing. Right. Somehow there is a slight awareness of nothing. And then in that moment of awareness, there is suddenly limitless light, and then the rest of it starts from there. Now, how do we get from one state to the other? Beats the crap out of me, but somehow we did. We think.
And I'm just thinking, though, that we can, in this group, continue to go on to a path to be able to positively look at logic of how something can happen outside of what we're discussing.
Right.
So that's just where I'm coming from. In some teachings, you know, we come from a collective consciousness, and then we form ourselves as a singularity to pull away to create experience. And when we create everything, including, like I said, all of the laws that so many people said, oh, that God created these laws. Of course not. But that's just where I'm trying to figure out then, after the I, how is it then formed together to form the spectrum, to form the mass of everything else? When you said there's a form of nothing to begin with, what about the opposite of that, that everything was just a full collective?
So you're talking about singularity, and this is the problem that we have, because when you pass through a singularity, everything that went on before there's no relation to what happens next.
Right.
And right now we don't have enough information, yeah, or at least we don't understand how to interpret the information to be able to say what happened before we got to that initial point.
Well, wasn't that the information created at the point of going forward from the point of I?
I would say that there was information at that point, but whether it was created or whether it's a corruption of what was before, or whether it was a transitive, I think is the word I'm looking for, transitive form of what came out before. Maybe it all exploded out of a white hole. I don't, an inverted black hole. I don't know. I'd love to be able to answer that question, but like I said, there's levels of consciousness that we work through, okay? And I'm curious to see where the conversation goes, because I don't think I personally have enough information to answer that question.
I may not be understanding your question, but if I'm understanding what you're asking, where does the spectrum come from? In my mind, it just arises out of the fact that information or consciousness, or whatever you want to call it, can assemble itself in increasingly complex configurations. And so the spectrum is really just a description of what is the range of complexity that it can vary between, from absolutely nothing to an extremely highly organized state that functions in complex ways.
Right, but it has to go from that point up to a spectrum. It has to be created.
It has to be created? I'm not sure I understand what you're saying.
So you're saying that there was a beginning?
I'm not. I'm just questioning even before that. I mean, as I said, the collective consciousness, no, I haven't gone into that, but whenever you come into a singularity, that's whenever the singularity then creates everything. It's like, I'm looking at everyone here going, well, I'm sharing this information with everybody else. But then again, as a comic would say, I might be, there's a possibility. I could be in a white room with padded cells and going, oh, what's consciousness? Oh, I don't know. Right. But so that's my reality of what I've created.
I have one contribution to make, that one thing that you said, consciousness has the ability to organize itself in increasingly complex ways. I think actually not that consciousness organizes itself, but realizes its inherent potential for greater and greater organization. So rather than consciousness organizing itself, the conclusion I've come to from the, studying NDEs and past life memories and after-death communication and all that, is that each of us actually is part of a complete, total, always was, always is consciousness. And when we're born, we're embodied, and the brain limits. This isn't my new idea. William James said this, and maybe people way before him, that the brain limits our access to all that is. And that as we, what evolution is the increasing realization of what we really already have, but have had limited access to. So, I don't know if that
Well, the brain is a limiting organism.
The brain is, and it's, I think it's very interesting that we're sitting here all trying to figure all this out, with our little pea brains. And it's a little brain trying to know the mind of God, or whatever you want to call the all that is. So, yeah.
I'd like to add a little bit on, and I agree so much with what Jan says, and getting into awareness. My thing is on the other end of the spectrum, is that I'm really into practical. How do you make practical use in your day-to-day life and consciousness? And I think all this stuff is true. In fact, I think everything's true. And we all know the truth, because the truth is relative, it's subjective. And we think there's an absolute truth out there, but that would be that as if there's one mind. And we're all experiencing our own reality in minute different ways, and we all think we're experiencing, and we argue about things as if we're looking at the same thing, like the elephant, right? So to me, consciousness is about awareness and being human, and the evolution, and there's an evolution of matter becoming self-conscious, self-creating. And the human species is at the pinnacle of that. And what consciousness, to me, I call it lucid living. Or because of the name of my, I guess my group, and what I believe in is empowered living. So empowered consciousness is getting to a state where we are, as humans, consciously choosing our perspectives. Because what happens is we get into a knee-jerk reaction. Anytime there's any kind of violence, it's a knee-jerk fight or flight. And animals are in this mode for seconds, minutes at a time, and they let it go. We're in that mode for 70% of our life, every time there's any kind of conflict. And when we're running in that, and we're not aware of it. So it's awareness is about being aware that, I got triggered from this experience, and I have a knee-jerk reaction to pull out a gun and shoot somebody, but I don't really want to do that. That's my animal side. So it's the evolution from instinctual reaction to obsessive being in fight or flight, to being aware of my emotion. I had that emotions, and now I have a thought, but is that thought connected to my belief system? I suddenly see this person as an evil person. Is that, is that my core belief, or is this a belief that I picked up and when I get triggered? So consciousness is about becoming more and more aware in your everyday life, and realizing how we are all creating our realities, and whether it's a reality we're enjoying or not. Yes.
Do you think that humans are the only aware creatures?
I think everything is aware, like they spoke about. Animals are aware, and I think the essence within every living creature on some level is love. That's the essence of all of us. But animals are coming from a more instinctual. So there's that love or creationism that's coming through everything as it's expanding, but a lot of it's automatic. So within, let's say, dogs, there's certain personality. They all have a unique personality, but there's common personalities between breeds of dogs. So there's a biological and evolutionary, and same thing with men and women. There's some generalities. between that, between a collective consciousness, groupthink, between children and teenagers and adults. So I don't know if that
Well, the
addresses
reason
what
I
you're
ask
saying.
is the next question is, do you think we reach out to the higher consciousness, or the higher consciousness propels us to grabs us?
I think as humans, we are born with a seed of thinking outside the box, and society tries to conform us. Animals, I don't think say, a squirrel says, I really don't want to be a squirrel. I want to morph into something else. But as humans, I think innately children are designed to be renegades and independent thinkers. And that's part of the evolution. There's an evolutionary reason for that, for the survival of the species and the expansion of the species, and also on a higher level, on a spiritual level. There is a spiritual, something beyond the physical, transpersonal, beyond religion, religious beliefs, that is causing that desire to find the truth, to find the answers.
Rob, can I add something to that? I'll be quick. There's a thought process which I believe that we basically are one organism, okay? We take in sunlight and we spit out spaceships and planes. If you look at DNA, there's a process that they've discovered called quantum sensing, where every cell sends out a signal saying, I am this type of cell. It sends it out in two ways. It sends it out in a discrete way, which is a molecule that only cells of that same thing can pick up on, and it sends it out in a generic form, which is like the trade language, so that every other cell can understand what it's receiving. Okay? That's why E. coli becomes virulent, because E. coli counts how many of its brothers are around, and when it finds how many and it thinks it's got enough, then it comes after you and becomes virulent. So every cell has the ability to communicate with every other cell. It's an inbuilt process that we're just starting to unravel, and it's going to be the future to replace antibiotics, okay? Stopping these signals and so on. Now, the reason I bring that up is because you were asking about animals specifically. Animals, I believe, are part of the process. I think human beings right now are the current end game of that process, okay? But that isn't necessarily the final end game. I think our specific job as a species is to move life itself off of this one rock. I think that's a big part of the process that is undergoing right now. Now let me add something before I can finish, and John, you can speak right after this. There is a thing called a sea squid that lives, funny enough, in the sea. And it's attached to this rock, okay? Maybe it's this weird kind of sea anemone thing, but most of the time it just sits on the rock. Every now and then it wants to breed. So it grows a brain, okay, unlike humans. And it uses that brain to navigate, and it wanders around, and then it finds a mate, and it breeds, and then it consumes its own brain. It doesn't need the brain anymore, it takes up too much energy, okay? So the brain is an organ that life or nature decides that it needs for a period of time. We may at some point, once we've achieved whatever it is that our group function is supposed to be, we may not be needing brains anymore.
That might have happened to some people already.
That may happen, yes.
Self-funded.
We've seen
Called
the
singularity.
right. So sorry, go on. Your thing. Then go ahead.
I was just gonna, I think, answer hers.
All right.
Because I think it related to what she's, when you asked, do we reach out to higher consciousness and connect with it, or does it reach down and connect with us? To me, the way I look at that is when your hands smack against each other, did your right hand touch your left, or did your left hand touch your right? That's kind of how I view that question that you asked.
Well, the reason I ask that is, I apologize for jumping in. For example, an ant has an awareness of ant, correct? So if I'm sitting here talking to you all and listening to you all, we share a common consciousness at this point. That's just like a basic consciousness thing. So how do I, and you all, even though you're much more educated than I am, raise our level of consciousness? And can we? Because that ant is only aware of being an ant. Me, I'm only aware of being a woman living in the United States, have two kids just turned 29. So these are my awareness, and even if I expand my awareness that there is this earth, there is universe, there is black hole, even though I accumulate that knowledge, which is not necessarily what I need to know to expand my awareness. To me, awareness is a completely different thing. But, so my question is, how could I possibly reach out to a higher consciousness within that parameters? Ant cannot become a human because its awareness expands, can it? So this is.
Well, there's two different ways, in my mind, there's two different ways of answering your question. One which is extremely philosophical, which is the ant and the human are really the same thing. They're just, water in a thimble versus water in a bucket. That's one way of answering it. Another way of answering it, if you come on the flip side of that and say, how do I raise my consciousness to expand it, to try and have a better connection with a larger consciousness? My answer to that, which is what I put in the book, I've read through Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, just on and on through all kinds of religions. I've looked through all kinds of philosophies, and I've looked through psychology, physics, field after field after field. And what I have seen is that the sages, the teachers of humanity, if you read what they said, what I have seen, certainly there's many more answers than this. I'm just telling you what I have picked out. I've seen 21 things that they keep telling us over and over and over again. If you have these skills, it expands your consciousness. And it could be argued, if you don't follow these skills, really what's happening is you're constricting your consciousness. It's not that you need to expand it, it's that you need to let go of the constrictures that we get programmed into. But however it is, there's 21 things that I've seen talked about in every culture, every school of thought, everywhere I've looked that studied consciousness in depth, and I kept seeing over and over and over, these 21 things are skills, you might say, that really have a very large impact on raising people's consciousness if they master those skills.
Which are what?
There in your book.
I'd like to answer this question from the opposite end. Because to me, the people that have had often transformational, transpersonal experiences, I went from being a spiritual human being, having a spiritual experience, to an absolute knowing. For me, this is my truth, that I am a spiritual being having a human experience. And it's me getting in the way. It's not about all the techniques and stuff can be useful. It's about getting out of the way, because there is a larger part. This is what I realized in my experience, that there is a far larger part of me, and that as long as I'm focusing on trying to protect and get stuff from other people and defend myself, I'm blocking the essence of me and everybody else who's doing this. So to me, I work on the side of what's getting in the way. And what's getting in the way is variations of the fight, flight, or freeze. So fighting against something, anything, inner critic, outer critic, running away from things, being in a place of fear. Freeze would be not doing anything, or disassociation. So we do these things as coping things, and we grow up when we have traumatic experiences in our life, and we kind of build calluses and dysfunctional coping mechanisms that block. So it's not like, how do I get into this? How do I tap into this? Where do I go? What country, what guru do I go to? There is a part, my belief, in every one of us, a individualized part that is wanting to reaching out. But the first thing is asking and being open to how it manifests, and it can manifest in so many different ways. And the techniques can be useful too. But
so the eye of the eye, the eye of the eye, is not a cellular structure,
It's to
as
me,
he mentioned.
well, he said both.
But it's
It's connected. We're individualized, but in my experience, we are all part of that oneness, and like Jan was saying. So what happens is, we come into this individual body and we're egotized, and we're living individual perspectives that are great value, because we are that source, essence, discovering itself and redefining and manifesting different aspects on a physical level. Like love is a spiritual quality, but we are learning. This is, when I had my experience, it's like, okay, I have all these insights. I left high school halfway through, and I had this experience about a year later. And it's like all these insights are coming to me, and it's like, okay, what am I doing here? I see all these spiritual truths as absolute truth. Why am I here? And then I realized, well, it's one thing to know these things. It's another thing to implement them and live from that perspective. So to me, life's journey is about an evolvement of the species, and on the individual level, is how can I see myself and the world from a more loving, inspired, connected, all connected, but still individualized perspective.
So I can give an example. I never really thought about it until I saw this example. You know, every now and then the weather gets really damp and a whole bunch of mushrooms spring up, right? I never really paid attention to it, but I always thought they were just mushrooms that kind of sprung up. Well, in our street, recently I've seen them grow in a circle, right? They're not growing in a circle because they all got together and said, hey, let's form a circle, right? They are actually connected. There is something going on underneath. These mushrooms are a representation or a manifestation of what this organism underneath the surface is trying to do. We are a representation of a point of view, okay? We all have these points of view, okay? But we are part of this, I believe, of this one superorganism or hyperorganism, whatever you want to call it, that has its own purpose. Now, in terms of consciousness, should our primary goal be, as individuals, to pursue higher consciousness? Some might say yes, some might say no. But let me put it to you like this. I know a lot of people, very interested people, that have no purpose in life. They haven't figured it out yet. They want one, but they haven't figured it out. Now, imagine you're in a dark room and you're looking for a piece of cheese. And you try and shine a laser. And the laser covers a little spot and you don't see much cheese. Okay, let's say it's the first level of consciousness. Then you get a flashlight, one of those little mag-light ones, okay, and you look down, and now you can see more space, okay? You still can't find the cheese, all right? Then you get one of those big old searchlights, and now finally, on the edge of that searchlight, you can finally see the cheese. Well, going through layers of consciousness is kind of like that. If you don't have, if you don't know what your purpose is in life, and some people do from a very early age, if you don't know what your purpose is in life, expanding your consciousness can absolutely help you figure that out.
Assuming you know what cheese is.
Well, that's right. Sometimes you don't know until you find it. There you go, there's something yellow there. I'll show you that.
So, just one quick thing that I haven't heard anybody else say. The fact that you're actually asking the question is you reaching out. And is it the divine essence in you that's having you ask the question? Like, which way is, kind of like John said, when you clap, which hand clapped, right? I don't see that part as being really that important. It's just that you're asking the question, so you've already got it in you to ask the question. That's the reaching out part. The practical application of, like, because I heard you ask how would you do that, is like meditation. Any practice that gets you to be self-aware, as you increase your self-awareness, like you understand the mechanism of, oh, my mind is doing this, or I'm making this interpretation, or this is my reaction to that because of something that happened in the past. The more aware you get of yourself and how yourself works, then the more aware you can get, you can see like how this is playing out with everybody else. So to me, the first step for anybody is start with meditation or yoga or whatever, something like that, to increase your own self-awareness of yourself. And then it'll just naturally start to expand.
I'd like to offer just another practical exercise, as our beliefs, our self-identity is the limitation. Like Rob said, it's not so much of reaching out as getting out of the way and just opening up. And that's meditation. Now, one of the things that you said that I am a woman, I have 2 kids, so I am a mother. And one of the things that I say is, my name is Daniel Danovi. I happen to be a man. That's part of the role that I'm playing. So one way of opening up is letting go or wandering past our limiting views of ourself. Just pretend that you can connect. Get curious. I wonder if I could connect, how might I do it? How might I open up even more? So if we are able to drop the limiting beliefs that we have about, and that's the 21 aspects, where we can, embrace more love, be more accepting, like let go of our expectations. Don't be so rigid about how the communication has to show up. Like just be open.
I apologize for confusion, but I didn't ask how I can reach for the higher consciousness. My question was about the awareness, because I don't think awareness has anything to do with consciousness. And I just wanted to know the panel's point of view on that. But I wasn't asking about how I can reach.
Well, we're already connected to higher consciousness. It's already there. It's only in our perception that we're not. Our consciousness is no higher than that of an ant or that of bacteria. Because if that consciousness wasn't present, or that consciousness expression, if the worms weren't present, or the bacteria, we wouldn't be here. Because they support our interaction. It's all interconnected. And there's an idea of the microbiome. There's 100 trillion bacteria that are in your body that you could not exist without. Now,
there's more of them than cells.
Yep, there's more bacteria than are actually, but it's a field of consciousness. When you get a craving for a particular food, is it your body or is it the bacteria that's asking for the food? And so